Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Teal Reed, for that very generous introduction. I am indeed going to talk about Donald Trump, hence the pun in the title. It's required. Yeah, thank you. Super generous. I'm feeling much better about the audience. This can't go badly now, this level of generosity. I want to say something very quickly about Theodore Mitau and this lecture. It is, of course, a great honor to give this lecture that is named for him. But I also want us to think for a moment about what he knew in 1934 when he left Germany for McAllister. He could see the sort of the xenophobic nationalism that was busy constructing enemies without and within. He could see the shift to discrimination. He could see open invocations of violence. What he could not see would be genocide that was going to follow just a half dozen years later. I don't think we are in the same position as post-war Europe. There are certainly as post-World War I Germany. Nevertheless, there are trends in the United States that are frightening. And I don't think in my life I've ever had a sense that our country has been as close as we are now to a demagogic politics that eschews the role of law and that is open in its call for hating others and for violence. And I really have in mind, and this is a very, very, very small example, but it's symptomatic of a political line I did not think we would cross. I have in mind that on several occasions Donald Trump has said protesters should be roughed up, or he wants to punch a protester in the face. This is a candidate for president who is essentially endorsing a form of vigilantism that invites a level of violence in his followers, but that really communicates a deep disrespect for democracy and for dissent. It's that sort of disrespect for democracy combined with a sense of fear, with a sense of betrayal, with a sense that violence might be the appropriate response that is incredibly dangerous. And we cannot know what will happen this year. We cannot know what will happen over the next half dozen years. But we need to take seriously the idea of a Mitau lecture rooted in the idea that sophisticated societies can veer out of control, right? And that has to be the sort of cautionary tale for all of us, as stark and as disconcerting as that is. Okay. So Donald Trump, you already know this. This is Trump announcing his candidacy.
The U.S. has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. Thank you. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Okay, so I was relieved when he got to that last part because my wife's Mexican, and I was like starting to look at her, and then she's like, oh no, she must be one of the good ones. So when he first announced his candidacy, people said, you know, I remember one politician described him as an immigrant-bashing carnival barker, which he clearly is. But he's also quite successful, right? And it is very likely at this point that he will be the Republican nominee for president in 2016. So what happens when we describe him as a xenophobe, as a demagogue, as this immigrant-bashing carnival barker? We tend to think of Trump as a sort of this epiphenomena, like he's unique, like we haven't seen this before. But it's very important, and well, let me be clear, and I'll come back to this at the end of the talk. In some ways, we haven't seen what he's doing. But I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. The main body of my talk is actually to convey a different message, that we have seen this. And in fact, the groundwork has been laid for this over the last 50 years by a Republican and then by a Republican and Democratic politics that has talked to voters in coded racial terms. If you think about terms like welfare queen, gangbanger, super predator, inner city, illegal alien, or contrary-wise, if you think about silent majority, the heartland, hardworking taxpayers, real Americans, all of these, I suggest, are dog whistles. And by a dog whistle, I mean a form of political speech which on its surface is silent, but underneath communicates a powerful message. In this case, silent about race, but communicating a powerful message that we are under threat from dark, dangerous, undeserving others, right? And I want to put Donald Trump firmly in that tradition, that he is in the tradition of Republican dog whistling. This is the other part of that tradition. We tend to think about race and its role in politics as if it's the last resort of marginal candidates. So, for example, you might think Newt Gingrich in 2008 running, campaigning for president was describing Barack Obama, in 2012 was describing him as the best food stamp president in history, right? So, again, this is sort of fringe candidates resorting to race. That's an enormous mistake. In fact, this coded racial speech is at the heart of American politics, and it's tied to a particular vision of governance, which says government is the problem, trust the marketplace, and unleash the power of the rich. And this is exactly what Donald Trump's proposing. So if you ask Trump, what are your proposals? He's got several. He's going to build a wall. He's going to keep out all Muslims. He's going to negotiate a tough deal with China. I mean, you know what I mean? These things are absurdities. What does he have in terms of real policy? He's got a detailed plan to slash taxes back to levels we last saw in 1898. He wants to cut the tax rate for the very rich by 1/3 of where it is now. We're already at historic lows, right? And this is dog whistle politics. Dog whistle politics is the use of coded racial fears to scare voters into supporting the policy preferences of the plutocrats. This is the story that I'm going to tell. This is the story that Donald Trump embodies. To really understand this story, we need to go back 50 years, a little bit more than 50 years now. We need to go back to the last time a Democratic candidate for president won a majority of the white vote. And I'll just say that again because to me it's like mind-boggling. The last time a Democratic candidate for president won a majority of the white vote. It wasn't Jimmy Carter, it wasn't Bill Clinton, it surely wasn't Barack Obama. It was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And going back to then, I want to show you this campaign ad that Johnson ran.
Poverty is not a trait of character. It is created anew in each generation, but not by heredity, by circumstances. Today, millions of American families are caught in circumstances beyond their control. Their children will be compelled to live lives of poverty unless the cycle is broken. President Johnson's war on poverty has this one goal: to provide everyone a chance to grow and make his own way, a chance at education, a chance at training, a chance at a fruitful life. For the first time in the history of America, this can be done. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
That was a Bernie Sanders ad from last week. No, okay. Come on, please. A little bit, come on. But it's been 50 years since we've heard a politician talk in this sort of language. A politician saying to us, poverty is not a trait of character. It's not personal. It's not dysfunctional. Poverty is a function of circumstances. And if it's a function of circumstances, we, the wealthiest country in the world, have the ability and indeed the moral duty to end it, to create routes of upward prosperity for everybody in this country. That's astounding. That's astounding. Now, again, Bernie Sanders is saying something similar. And in saying that today, he's talking to the language of political revolution, and he's being dismissed as sort of pie in the sky, dreamer, unrealistic. How did Lyndon Johnson do? He swept the country. It was a landslide victory. 67% of whites voted for Lyndon Johnson, voted for the idea that activist government has the moral duty to ensure that everybody has a chance at a decent and prosperous life. We voted overwhelmingly for it. And in fact, the pundits in 1964 looked at this crushing victory and said, that's it. We are a liberal country that believes in the power of activist government from the New Deal to Johnson's Great Society. That's one thing that really astounds me. Here's the other thing that astounds me about that ad, if you were watching. What was the face of poverty? What was the color of the face of poverty? Today, if I say poverty, the poor, or if instead I say the middle class, what sorts of faces, what color is triggered in your imagination? We tend today, I think, to think of the poor in colored terms, in dark terms, and middle class has become a code for white. And yet what Lyndon Johnson was saying is many of the poor are white. And indeed what he was drawing on was a tradition in which many of the programs that led to the greatest expansion of the middle class the country has ever seen were programs that were largely geared for whites. Right? And we have lost tremendous ground exactly at the moment when we began to think that programs that aim to alleviate poverty were giveaways to undeserving minorities. And this is partly what you see in that alarm bell in the South. Lyndon Johnson wins in a landslide. He loses in Arizona, which is the home state of his opponent Barry Goldwater, and he loses in the 5 states in the Deep South with the largest African American population. So let me talk to you a little bit about Barry Goldwater. Running against Lyndon Johnson in 1964, he's the son of a wealthy retail family in Arizona. He's elected senator from Arizona. There he is looking like a senator. But he also styles himself a cowboy. Right? And it's not just a sort of Arizona affectation. It's an ideological stance. Barry Goldwater is a die-hard believer in the ideal of the rugged individual. And the rugged individual as a cultural phenomena says everybody should be responsible for themselves, everybody should be free to make their own choices, everybody should take care of their families, contribute to their communities, but people are ultimately responsible for their own success and their own failure. That's cultural, but it's also political. It's also economic, because what it says is nobody owes anything to the government when they succeed, nor should anybody ask anything of government when they fail. Instead, they should have the cowboy's dignity, and if you fail, then lean up against the cactus, lower your hat over your head, and die quietly. Right? That's the rugged individual ideal. And that ideology, cultural and political, had been very popular, indeed had been used by the titans of industry during the progressive era to challenge government help as paternalism that somehow stripped people of their real manhood, of their masculinity. And yet this image of the rugged individual shriveled up and blew away in the winds of the Dust Bowl. Because the Great Depression helped people come to understand, as a nation, we came to understand, yes, personal responsibility is important, but structures are important too. The health of the economy, the power of the boss, the opportunities there are or are not available. We came to understand that the true liberty lies in actually having real choices. And that requires government assistance. Right? And here's Barry Goldwater peddling this old ideal. And he's about to win 5 states in the Deep South, and this is even more perplexing. Not only is he peddling this discredited ideology of the rugged individual, but he's promising to dismantle the New Deal. And the South loved the New Deal. In fact, Barry Goldwater is campaigning across the South saying that he is going to disassemble the Tennessee Valley Authority, which brought electricity to millions of people across the South. And he's promising to dismantle it, break it up, sell it apart, sell it away. And also, in case you haven't noticed, he's a Republican. Where the South, the Southern Democrats, they hate. I mean, I say hate, but that's obviously a serious understatement. It's more like loathe the Republicans. Right? They blame them for the war of aggression, sometimes called the Civil War. Right? Even more, it was a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, who was the first modern president to send federal troops back into the South to enforce desegregation. The Southern Democrats, they hate Republicans, and they're about to vote for a Republican who promises to break up and sell off the program that brought them electricity. Why would they do so? Goldwater had an idea about how to campaign. This is his idea. It's the only sort of block quote I'm going to show you. I wouldn't show it to you. I know how deadening these things are, but this is important. The Republicans understood that the Democrats had assembled a durable coalition of the white working and middle class, South and North, of African Americans outside of the South where they could vote, and of progressives across the country. And they thought to themselves, how can we win if we can't shatter that coalition? And if we're to shatter that coalition, can we use race to do so? Right? And what they see in 1963 is that the civil rights movement in the South, the demand for black equality, is increasing anxiety among whites and creating an opportunity to drive a wedge in the New Deal coalition. But precisely because it's in the context of the civil rights movement, the sort of racial politics of open white supremacy cannot succeed at the national level. So instead, they need to become the white man's party in fact, not in name. That is, in code, not expressly. Right? They're going to start to talk about the racial defense of whites in coded terms. And I want to be very clear about this. I want to hammer this point. This is not about bigotry. The Republican Party outside of the South and the Democratic Party outside of the South up until 1963 were equally committed to civil rights. This is not, I mean, if there is a white man's party in 1963, it's the Southern Democrats. It's the Southern Democrats who've constructed themselves expressly as a white supremacist party and have used fraud and deception and violence to completely disenfranchise African Americans. If there's a party permeated by bigotry, it's the Southern Democrats, not the Republicans. This is not a story of Republicans being racist somehow and deciding to give vent to their racism. This is a story of strategy, of the cold, calculated decision that the GOP can use rising racial anxiety to break the New Deal coalition and to win votes. It didn't work so well in 1964. Would it work in 1968 when Richard Nixon ran for president? It wasn't clear. And he largely stayed away from the sort of dog whistles that Barry Goldwater had used. Although, I have to say, just because we're here in McAllister, because we're here in Minnesota, Nixon did understand the power of race. And he secretly negotiated in the South to win the votes of Southern Democrats and some Southern Democrats like Strom Thurmond, who had already switched to the Republican Party. Right? Meanwhile, other votes went to George Wallace, a Democrat coming out of the South, who was running and picking up the votes of racially fearful whites. Richard Nixon barely wins over Hubert Humphrey, right, who was on the faculty here, I believe, I think, right? On the faculty, right? So barely wins. He's playing some racial politics, but he's also running as a sort of as a moderate Republican. It's not clear in 1968 how powerful race can be as a wedge issue. But after 1968, as the number crunchers look at Nixon's success, look at the amazing success of George Wallace, look at the numbers for Hubert Humphrey, number crunchers on both the Democratic side and the Republican side conclude by 1970 that race can be used to break the New Deal coalition. And at that point, Nixon pivots. And he begins to talk in racial code about law and order. He begins to talk about states' rights, by which he means the rights of southern states to resist federal mandates for integration. He begins to talk about forced busing, as if the issue were putting children on school buses rather than the school integration the busing was designed to achieve. Right? And was he talking? Did he know that he was race baiting? Yeah, he did. In fact, we have evidence of him watching one of his own campaign commercials about law and order, and Nixon saying, "That's it. That ad hits it right on the head. It's all about law and order and the damn Negroes and Puerto Ricans." He knew he was race baiting, yet he was talking in code. He was dog whistling. How would he do? Lyndon Johnson won 67% of the white vote in 1964. Richard Nixon won 70% of the white vote in 1972. 8 years after the political punditry concluded that we were fundamentally a liberal country and that the New Deal coalition of the white working and middle class, African Americans and progressives across the country was a durable majority, that coalition was broken, shattered. And now, you might say, well, Nixon in '72 running against McGovern, it's got to do with the riots, it's got to do with unrest on campus, it's got to do with Vietnam. Yes, it absolutely does. There are multiple factors here. But I want to suggest that what you see here is a tidal shift in how the country votes, and in particular in how whites vote. And as proof of that, think about the demographics of the Republican Party today. The Republican Party today draws over 90% of its support from white voters. And it is, in its elected officials, 98% white. The Republican Party today is whiter than most country clubs. That's not an accident. Right? They decided in '63 to become the white man's party, in fact, though not a name, and they did. That's what they've done. Right? And so this is dog whistle politics. They made a strategic decision in '63. They lost badly in '64, but they stuck with it, and by '72, they'd completely changed the nature of American politics. Right? And we're still living with that today. Okay, but that's only half the dog whistle politics story. That's the half that says race can be used to win votes. This is the other half. This is Ronald Reagan, looking amazingly jovial. He's very happy. He's very happy. Why shouldn't he be happy? He has just won the nomination to become the official Republican candidate for president in 1980. And this is his first campaign stop after winning that nomination. It's an incredibly important moment. He's introducing himself to the country for the first time as the official Republican candidate for president. And so he goes to Philadelphia, Mississippi. It's like, wait, you're going to introduce yourself to the country in Philadelphia, Mississippi? Well, sure, because it's where the Neshoba County Fair is. You've heard of that? Why is Mississippi, Philadelphia famous or infamous? Because 16 years earlier, 3 civil rights workers had been kidnapped there, killed, their bodies stuffed in an earthen dam, and not found for months. Ronald Reagan goes to the site of one of the most infamous lynchings in the civil rights movement. He arrives there in 1980. There wasn't a voter alive in 1980 in Neshoba County who hadn't been alive when these 3 civil rights workers were killed. And he announces his official candidacy for president saying, "I'm for states' rights." And when he says that, a crowd of 10,000 whites erupts in wild applause. Because what they hear, what he communicates, is that he supports the right of whites to resist integration. Right? This is Ronald Reagan as a master of the cultural provocation of race. But even more importantly for our story, we have to understand that unlike Nixon, Reagan was not a moderate Republican. Reagan gets his start in politics as a spokesperson for Barry Goldwater. He understands, he has absorbed the idea that government is the enemy. And he's figured out a way to sell that idea to the American public. And it goes something like this. Reagan would look out at his audiences frequently, and he would talk about welfare queens, or he would talk about strapping young bucks. And he would say to his audience, I understand your frustration when you're waiting in line to buy hamburger and some young buck is ahead of you buying T-bone steak with food stamps. Now, when he told that story with the some young buck, he was immediately subject to criticism because young buck is a Southern term for a strong black man. And it was too close to open racism. So he dropped the term. Some young fellow, he'd say when he'd repeat this story. And you think about this narrative, and what's he saying? He's saying, who are blacks? They're strong. They could work. They prefer not to. But it's not just that they're lazy. They're larcenous. They'd rather rip off the system. And being lazy and larcenous and ripping off the system, they're living better than you all. And it's the you, right? That's part of the racial narrative. Part of the racial narrative is who's black people. But the other part of the racial narrative is who are white people, right? And this is Reagan saying, I know how frustrated you are. And he's talking to his white audiences, and they were overwhelmingly white. In fact, this was sort of an awkward episode. Nancy Reagan, his wife, was introducing him at one point, and she says, it's wonderful to see so many beautiful white people. But that was a Freudian slip. Obviously, she didn't mean it. So she's sorry, just beautiful people, right? But he's talking to white audiences. Think too of that clip from Donald Trump. We start with this clip from Donald Trump, and Donald Trump saying, who's Mexico sending? And then he pauses and he says, they're not sending you. They're not sending you. Because the racial story of dark and dangerous and undeserving minorities is always coupled with a story of whites. Whites as decent, as hardworking, as law-abiding, as long-suffering. Indeed, the story is precisely because whites work hard and play by the rules and pay taxes. That's why whites are struggling to make ends meet, right? And so this is this racial narrative. This is the story of racial resentment. But the most important character in this story is neither blacks nor whites. The most hated, the most dangerous character in this story is government. It's government. Because Reagan is saying it's government that is reaching its hands into the pockets of hardworking, long-suffering whites and taking your money, taking your tax dollars, and wasting it on undeserving minorities. And it's government that refuses to control these dangerous super predators, these gangbangers, these kids involved in drug violence. Resent government because government won't protect you. And the modern version of it is hate government because government refuses to secure the border. Government won't protect you from these invading hordes of dangerous brown-skinned others. Right? The narrative says, fear people of color. Distrust government because it coddles them with welfare, coddles them with education, refuses to control them through lax criminal law and through lax border security. Trust instead the marketplace. Right? And Reagan would say, if government is the problem, I know what we can do. Starve it. Cut taxes. I know what we can do. Slash social spending that's just giveaways for poor people of color. I know what we can do. Get government out of the way of business. And those are all the policies that he pursued. Over the 1980s, the Reagan tax cuts, did they go to the person waiting in line to buy a hamburger? The Reagan tax cuts transferred $1 trillion of wealth to the top 1% over the course of the 1980s. We have not repealed those tax cuts yet. Every decade since, another $1 trillion plus in wealth is being transferred to the top 1%. Right? Reagan slashed spending. Yes, he did. On social programs, on social assistance, on wage replacement. But he actually increased spending. He increased the federal budget deficit because he started increasing spending that was going to government, to corporations. Big subsidies to big money. And this other business about getting government out of the way of business, right? He used the euphemism of deregulation, but deregulation isn't deregulation, it's re-regulation. It's allowing corporations to write the rules. To write the rules of the marketplace, to write the rules of the job place. And that's what corporations did. And this is the result. So, I liberated this from Robert Reich. This is from his video, Inequality for All. If you haven't seen it, his documentary, Inequality for All, I highly recommend it. Reich goes through in this documentary and explains the sorts of policies that generated massive wealth inequality. This is a graph that shows the share of total national income absorbed by the top 1%. You see it skyrocket through the 1920s. You see it collapse partly because of the collapse on Wall Street, but then you see it come down as the country as a whole pursues a set of policies, the New Deal, the Great Society, that actually redistribute wealth and create a broad and shared prosperity, or more fundamentally, the biggest expansion of the middle class the world has ever seen. And then it stalls right around 1970, and then right around 1980, inequality starts going up. And now you see this peak at 2007. That's just because the documentary is a little bit old. You know that 95% of the recovery since 2008 has gone to the top 1%. And the top 1% today has, again, takes a 1/4 of the income of the country. And that understates the wealth of the 1%, because this is about income rather than wealth. And if you think about wealth, the top 1/10 of 1% of this country own as much wealth as 90% of the rest of us. No democracy can survive with that level of wealth inequality, and that's where we are. How did we get there? Not exclusively, but nevertheless in large part through a racial narrative that says, fear people of color, distrust government, trust the marketplace. Okay, I'm going to pick up some important themes within this conversation about dogmas of politics. You now understand the basics. Use race to scare voters into resenting government and handing over power to the rich. Other important themes. This is Willie Horton. It's important for you to see this. Willie Horton, this is probably the sort of quintessential dog whistle ad. This was run by George H.W. Bush in 1988. He was Reagan's vice president. He was in trouble. He was in trouble in part because Reagan had deregulated the savings and loan industry, which had led in turn to massive fraud, which had led in turn to a collapse in the housing market, which had led in turn to an economic recession that lasted for several years. I'm not sure if you recognize that thread, the financial deregulation, massive fraud, crisis in the housing market, economic depression. I don't know if you've ever heard a story like that. That happened in the 80s with Ronald Reagan. And so George H.W. Bush, he's in trouble. He runs this ad, right? This is William Horton, but it turned out William Horton, the name William wasn't as scary as Willie, right? So they went with Willie Horton, right? Mugshot of an African American accused of stabbing a youth, then being released on furlough when he was accused of attacking and raping a white woman. Democrats in 1970, I said, realized race could be used as a wedge issue. And they decided right then that they would not respond. Why not? Because they made a basic analytic mistake. Democrats thought, this is a normal backlash. We pushed too fast and too far for civil rights. Let's back off. this backlash is going to blow over. But they were wrong because they failed to realize that conservatives would look for ways to continually reinvent and stoke racial resentment. Right? And so initially when the Willie Horton ad runs, Democrats stay silent for a month. And in that month, 12% of the electorate switched their support to H.W. Bush. And 2 weeks before the election, he's now several points ahead. And it's at this point, that one Democrat in particular changes tactics. Jesse Jackson, African-American, activist, preacher, leading Democratic figure. Finally, Jesse Jackson can't take it anymore. And Jesse Jackson comes out and says, this is race baiting. This is racial demagoguery. Nothing, Jackson says, is as ugly as innuendo of a black rapist victimizing a white woman. And immediately, the media responds. This is race baiting. This is ugly racial innuendo. This is demagoguery. Shut up, they say. Jesse Jackson. Right? Here's what happened. When I say the conservatives have adopted a rhetoric of coded speech, that's not the only way they talk about race. Instead, that's part of 3 separate moves. The first move is to constantly talk about race, but in coded terms, in terms that don't use racial epithets, that don't refer directly to color, that instead harp on culture or on behavior, right? And constantly inject race into the conversation. That's move number 1. That's dog whistling. Move number 2, proclaim your innocence. If anybody says, hey, that's xenophobia, that's racial pandering, you turn around and say, can't be, I didn't use a racial epithet, didn't say the word black, right? And so they would defend the Willie Horton ad. They would defend this ad by saying, point to me where it says the word black. Point to me where it says the word race. They defended this, and the media accepted that this wasn't about race because no one had said black. Right? So that's the second move. Third move, kick back at the critics by saying, but somebody has said the word race. Jesse Jackson said race. And the first person in the room to say race is the real racist. So go after him. Right? And they did, right? And this is, I call this the punch, parry, and kick. Punch it into the conversation in code. Parry any accusation of racism by saying, hey, I didn't say the word black. And then kick back by saying, but the person who said the word race is the real racist. And I got to tell you this, I get this all the time, right? I post things and videos and da-da-da-da. And almost all the time somebody responds by saying, Haney López, you're a racist. And what's the evidence? You talked about race, right? This is the move. And so Jesse Jackson, 2 weeks into 2 weeks before the campaign, starts talking about this racism, and he's slammed for being a racist. So the Democrats have now learned another lesson. You can't stay silent, but you can't talk about race either. So what can you do?
They're a new generation of Democrats, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and they don't think the way the old Democratic Party did. They've called for an end to welfare as we know it, so welfare can be a second chance, not a way of life. They've sent a strong signal to criminals by supporting the death penalty, and they've rejected the old tax and spend politics. Clinton's balanced 12 budgets, and they've proposed a new plan investing in people, detailing $140 billion in spending cuts they'd make right now. Clinton Gore, for people, for a change.
If you can't beat them, join them. And that's what they did. End welfare as a way of life? Well, whose way of life is it? Crack down on crime? Who are the criminals? Slash federal spending? Why? Is the federal government the enemy? Those are the dog whistle themes. And Clinton adopted all of them. And I just want to make a couple of points very clear. In adopting these themes, Clinton, even more than Reagan, trashed the social safety net. Clinton, even more than Reagan, contributed to the rise of mass incarceration. The Democrats entered into a competition with the Republicans to prove who could be toughest on people of color. And the result was devastating for communities of color. Not alone because of what the GOP was doing, but because the Democrats wanted to prove that they could be even tougher. That's point number one. Point number two, A lot of progressives look at Clinton and say, this is the point at which the Democratic Party walks away from the working class, starts to build close alliances with Wall Street, starts to build close alliances with the big corporations, starts to enter into trade negotiations that assist in shipping U.S. jobs overseas. These two are connected. Clinton, to get elected, understood that he had to walk away from liberalism because liberalism had been tainted as sops to people of color. But when he walked away from liberalism, he couldn't just walk away from people of color. He had to walk away from liberalism, which meant walking away from the working class as well. Right? Clinton marks a pivotal moment in the Democratic Party. The so-called New Democrats, they are effectively Reagan Republicans. Right? This is who they are. Except, let's be clear, they're about to get leapfrogged by the Republicans as the Republicans go even further to the right. But this is a major shift in the Democratic Party, where the Democratic Party essentially says, we'll adopt dog whistle politics as if that means just abandoning people of color, when what it really means is abandoning the working class, abandoning the middle class in favor of the interests of the largest donors, in favor of the financialization of the U.S. economy. Another big change in dog whistle politics, this is Professor Rick Perry. So, glasses make him look so much smarter. So this is before his run for the 2016 nomination. Just completely fizzled. He's back on the air. What he's going to do is he's going to conjoin. Well, watch what he does. Watch what he does.
We have record high numbers of other than Mexicans being apprehended at the border. These are people that are coming from states like Syria that have substantial connections back to terrorist regimes and terrorist operations. So, I mean, I think whether you're a Democrat or Republican, absolutely, you need to be addressing this, Mr. President.
This is Perry, whatever, he's a joke. But this is really important. This is really important. Dog whistling starts in the South with 1963, 1964, fear of African Americans. It always had this component of other racial boogeymen, right? Nixon in 1970 was talking, or 1972 was talking about the damn Puerto Ricans. Certainly when, in California and the Southwest, there's always been a fear of Latinos. After 9/11, the racial fears of the country shift remarkably. 9/11 creates a national discourse of a Muslim terrorist, of Islamic extremists, right? And this discourse is at once not about race, because it's about religion, it's about behavior, the extremism, the terrorism, and yet fueling it is powerful racial imagery. The sense that this is a clash of civilizations, the sense that the Muslim terrorist, the visual image behind that of the face of Osama bin Laden, right? And it's clear how powerful this racialized imagery is, because this is how we go to war against Iraq. What connected Iraq to 9/11? The hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, right, and the Iraqis, I mean, it's just like completely different people, completely different politics. There's no connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, except a racial one and a lie about weapons of mass destruction. Right? And this fear of the Muslim terrorist, it's a fear that's external, but importantly, it's a fear that's internal as well. Right? So you know that like Kansas is busy passing laws that prohibit any of its state courts from drawing on Sharia, Islamic religious law. Right? And that had been a big problem. A number of courts. This is crazy. But the narrative is we have been infiltrated by Muslims. And this connects up with the sense that the most powerful Muslim of them all is Barack Obama. Right? This is this projection, this creation of an internal racialized threat, right, that is continually projected onto Obama. Okay, once this narrative of brown-skinned, foreign others with a disregard for human life, with a threatening culture develops, it turns out to be very easy to fold undocumented immigrants, Latinos, Mexicans into that basic narrative. And fear of undocumented immigrants goes national in scope. In fact, if you think back to, if you think just, I don't know if any of you watched the Republican debate in New Hampshire. The Republican debate in New Hampshire was all about Mexico. It was about building a wall on the southern border. I'm like, I would keep out the Canadians. They're the real threat in New Hampshire, right? But nobody cares about that, right? And then they said, well, you know, okay, well, what about, let's get off of immigration. Let's talk about trade. And Donald Trump says, trade, China's killing us. Mexico's killing us, right? And it sounds like it's about trade, but again, it's really about race. And then the next conversation is, well, okay, well, what's happening on the ground in New Hampshire? And the candidates say, heroin is devastating these poor communities, these poor white communities. And it's coming from Mexico. Build a wall. Right? And it turns out that even in New Hampshire, the biggest threat is the southern border. Build a wall. Because we don't know who's coming across. And it could be Mexicans. It could be Syrians. We can't tell. We just know they're brown. They're threatening us. They aim to destroy our way of life. Right? And this is this other huge development. One other development that's really important to notice, Fox and Friends. A lot of dog whistling has been coming from politicians. Fox and Friends institutionalizes it as a business plan. It's good business because stirring up fear and panic, stirring up strong emotion, generates viewer loyalty. Right? 1/4 of whites are regular watchers of Fox. And 100%, okay, that's probably an exaggeration, but close to 100% of Fox News is racial panic, right? 100, close. It's like fear people of color, hate the government, trust corporations. That's their basic message, which they develop into a business plan and they're constantly amplifying. Okay. This is really the sort of the last big development in dog whistling I want to talk to you about. You know this excerpt. This is Mitt Romney. He's running for president. He says he doesn't care about half the country. Can't possibly be dog whistling anymore because half the country, that's not people of color anymore. Listen to his language.
There are 47% of the people who will vote for the president no matter what. All right, there are 47% who are with him, who are dependent upon government, who believe that they are victims, who believe that government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe that they're entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it. But it's an entitlement, and the government should give it to them. And they will vote for this president no matter what. And so my job is not to worry about those people. I'll never convince them that they should take personal responsibility and care for their lives. What I have to do is convince the 5 to 10% in the Senate.
Listen to that language. That is the language of the rugged individual. It has come back. These are people who are dependent on government, who refuse to take responsibility for themselves, who have an entitlement mentality, who will never take care of themselves. And we don't have to care about them. We don't have to care about them. Now, we as a country turned our back on that sort of cold-hearted ideology. Right? And yet it has come back. It has come back into our political conversation. How? Because that language was reintroduced and sold as a way to understand African Americans. They're the ones who had an entitlement mentality. They're the ones who are lazy and larcenous, who refused to take care of themselves, who just wanted free stuff from government. But that language didn't stay with people of color. It has now migrated to half the country. And we should just be clear, who's this half the country? He's saying 47%. And what does Mitt Romney mean? He means the 47% of the country that doesn't pay federal income taxes. All right? And this is this language of makers and takers. As if the people not paying federal income tax aren't nevertheless paying sales tax, paying Social Security tax, paying Medicare tax, paying property tax. In fact, the average tax burden of those people who don't pay federal income tax, 14% of their total income. Otherwise known as slightly more than Mitt Romney himself was paying. That son of a bitch. He's paying less than the people he is dismissing as freeloaders. He's paying less than the people he's dismissing as freeloaders. And listen to what he's saying. He's saying to the country, I want to be president. I don't care about half y'all. And as policy, I'm going to cut taxes for the very rich. I'm going to slash government spending on social assistance. And I'm going to get government out of the way of corporations. Let corporations write their own rules. Right? These are the things he promised. Right? Now, how'd he do? Well, he lost. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. Did I? So no, he lost. He lost. I want to be, okay. How do you do among whites? This is what the electoral map would have looked like if Mitt Romney had, if only whites had voted. Mitt Romney won 3 out of 5 white votes. Now, New York Times, right after this, quoted a Republican operative who said there just aren't enough old white men anymore to elect Republicans. That's not old white men. Mitt Romney won among old white men. He won among white men. He won among white women. He won among every age cohort of whites, including 18 to 24. Mitt Romney won in every major demographic cohort of whites. And this is not a story of diminishing racial prejudice in the electorate like it was really bad in 1972 with Nixon, it's getting worse. Mitt Romney, the only 2 presidential elections in which whites have gone for Republicans in greater proportion, Richard Nixon in 72 and Ronald Reagan in his re-election in 84. Right? Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote. Had he won 62% of the white vote, he would have carried the popular vote nationally. In 2014, Republicans running for the House won 62% of the white vote. Right. This is the setting in which we find ourselves now. Increasing anxiety about the economy and increasing anxiety about demographic change in the country is leading to a politics in which the majority, a strong supermajority of whites, support politicians who disdain them and promise to pursue policies that are good for the very rich. So I've been talking about Trump. I want to show you it's not just Trump. Plus, I love this ad.
There's a scorpion in the desert. For most of us, its venom is a clear and deadly threat. But others refuse to even speak its name. Since the scorpion seeks our destruction, isn't it time we recognize the scorpion for what it is before it strikes again?
I'm Ted Cruz.
Ted Cruz with his ostrich skin boots. Yeah, the Princeton, Harvard, Texan everyman, I guess. By the way, obviously he thinks scorpions don't vote. It doesn't matter whether it's Mexicans. It doesn't matter whether it's ISIS or whatever, right? There's this vague threat crossing the southern border. I want to connect up. So Cruz is a front runner. Marco Rubio is a front runner. Let me just say this really quickly. Can this be dog whistle politics if this is Cruz, if this is Rubio, if these are Latinos? And I want to say, again, on the part of Cruz and Rubio, dog whistle politics is not about bigotry. It's about strategy. And these two understand that you have to talk. I mean, you know, here's Ted Cruz, who is saying, Ted Cruz is not just saying he'd build a wall. Ted Cruz is saying he will round up 11 million people and deport them, right? And when he says that, so my mother came from El Salvador in the late 1950s, early 1960s. My family has been here a long time, and yet I have family members here who fled death squads in El Salvador and who are here illegally. When he says he's going to round up 11 million people, he's talking about rounded up my family, right? And is it bigotry? No, He understands the fear that grips so much of the Republican primary electorate. Right? This is dog whistle politics in brownface. And now turn it around. What about the voters who are reacting to this? I think it's important to understand that the racism on the part of these politicians is strategic, but the racial fears that they're appealing to are subterranean. They're unconscious. They're not talking to people who, by and large, who understand themselves self-consciously as white supremacists. Indeed, they're talking to people who themselves are deeply committed to the proposition that racism is immoral, and that they are not racist. And in some perverse way, it's helpful to have candidates like Cruz, like Rubio, like Ben Carson, spewing this sort of racial poison with a brown or black face that makes it seem like, how could this be racism? Because after all, it's a Hispanic who's saying it, right? Okay, I want to come back now to Trump. There is, my central point, we've been doing this for 50 years. My central point, we laid the groundwork for Trump. My central point, Trump understands the Republican primary voter that has been created over 50 years of telling people fear minorities, distrust government, trust the marketplace. That's my central point. Something different is going on with Trump. Here's what I think it is. Dog whistle politicians have used code to hide their racial references from two groups: liberal critics and their audience. Right? Trump has realized he doesn't need to hide the racism from the liberal critics. Indeed, he seems to have realized that liberal critics help him, because many whites have come to understand accusations of racism as itself a form of racism against whites. So when people react to Donald Trump, when the New York Times or the Washington Post reacts to Donald Trump by saying you're engaged in xenophobic pandering, which the Washington Post has, Donald Trump can hold it up and say, I don't have a racist bone in my body, never said anything racist, and you're the ones who are racist attacking me. Right? And so he furthers this sense of whites who are embattled, whites who are aggrieved, whites who are the real victim. And yet, he's very careful never to use a racial epithet, never to talk in express terms about color. Right? He's got to stop short of crossing that line. Because if he crosses it, his supporters can no longer tell themselves, I'm not racist, this is just common sense, which is another one of Donald's lines. They can't tell themselves that if he uses a racial epithet, right? He cannot say, we got to keep spics out of this country. He can say we got to build a wall. He can say we can't allow them in. He can say they're criminals. He can say they're rapists. But he can't use that racial epithet. What just happened this weekend? Donald Trump was endorsed by David Duke, by the Klan. And on Sunday, he was asked, do you disavow this? Right? And he feigned confusion. He said, I don't know who these groups are. You got to tell me who these groups are. I don't know David Duke. He's like, every Muslim, I'd bar them because I know them. And all these Mexicans, I'd keep them out. I know them. But the Klan, I don't really know. That didn't work. That didn't work. And today he's been backpedaling furiously because it's a requirement of the new racism, including the racism on the right, that you take a strong stand against racism. Right? Ronald Reagan used to say, in addition to his stories about welfare queens and black bucks, bigots are sick. Because it's very important that you establish your moral bona fides by saying, I am against racism, and then narrowly defining racism as Klan-style bigotry, and then going on with your dog whistle ways. Right? And Donald Trump just about crossed that line, because he didn't repudiate the Klan, and now he's backpedaling, he's repudiating the Klan. And in repudiating the Klan today, we see he is still dog whistling. He is still talking to an audience that doesn't think they're racist, doesn't want to be racist, but nevertheless, they're driven by, they organize their lives in terms of these subterranean, these subconscious racial fears. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. Some core points. This is for all the good progressives. Progressives think that we have to focus on class. And they also think that once we focus on class, we'll solve the race problem. And by progressives, I mean Bernie Sanders. Right? You listen to him talk about race, and he says, just let me solve class, and that's going to solve race. And here's the basic point of everything I've been saying. You cannot solve class in the United States because class politics has been driven by race. Class politics has been driven by race. There is a circular relationship that connects up racial fear to a distrust of government, to widening inequality, to more racial fear, to further distrust of government, to increasing inequality. The only way to address problems with class is to solve the race problems. And for all the Black Lives Matter folks, you can't understand what we've done in this country to people of color unless you understand that we've done it politically with thorough indifference to communities of color. Right? If you talk to the Black Lives Matter folks, people want to talk about cultural prejudice or bigotry or implicit bias or maybe structural racism. Yeah, that's all important, but the most important is the strategic racism of both political parties. Think about mass incarceration and police violence. What produced that? Bigotry on police forces? There's some of that. That's not what drove this. What drove this was a political culture in which politicians, Republican and Democrat alike, said to the police, you are the last thin blue line between civilization and savagery. Protect those decent, hardworking taxpayers from those larcenous, dangerous super predators. And if you tell a story like that, you get mass incarceration. When Nixon started, there was 200,000 people in federal prisons and jails, federal and state prisons. Now there's 2.3 million. Right? You get mass incarceration, but even more, you get a policing that is racialized, that deals with whites as people who deserve protection, and deals with people of color as people who are fundamentally animals that need to be healed. Right? That is driven by racial politics. So I would say to the Black Lives Matter folks, you can't solve problems of race unless you deal with our politics and our economics around race. Right? That is, we need a progressive movement that thinks simultaneously about racial and economic justice. We can't make progress on either of those alone. Okay, concrete suggestions. Speak out. Speak out against racism, and in particular against colorblindness. Understand that colorblindness, now I get colorblindness, I get the moral sense that we shouldn't talk about race, and I get that it has good sort of liberal origins. It kind of tries to suppress the idea that what's most important about us is race and that we should see each other as humans. I'm all in favor of that. But look at the way colorblindness has been hijacked by conservative discourse. It's colorblindness that tells us that it's only racism if someone says the word race. And so all this talk about illegal aliens and super predators and silent majority in the heartland, that can't be race. And it's colorblindness that tells us it's always racism when someone does say the word race. This is what makes affirmative action supposedly racism. Someone said the word race, someone used race, right? Speak out about race, talk about it, talk about the way it structures our economy, structures the life chances of everyone in this society. Do not be cowed by colorblindness. And when you talk about race and somebody says to you, because you're talking about race, you must be the racist, you can say, hey, dialing 911 doesn't mean you committed the crime. You can say, hey, pulling the fire alarm doesn't mean you set the fire. Or Jon Stewart had an even better one. Jon Stewart had an even better one. This is sort of scatological. This works best for fourth graders. He was talking to this Republican who said, you know, they're talking about race all the time. There must be, who talks about race? The racist. And Jon Stewart replied, did you just he who smelt it dealt it racism? Right? And it's exactly right. We have an easy response. But that response is much easier once you see it's just a stock move. It's a way to silence us. Okay, speak out against racism. Next. We must address the real anxieties in our society. These anxieties, there are two central anxieties. what's happening in terms of our economy and what's happening in terms of our demography. In terms of our economy, we have to be clear. We are systematically transferring more and more wealth and power to the top 1/10 of 1%. And when we do so, we impoverish the rest of the country and we limit social mobility. And in fact, we disinvest from public infrastructure, we disinvest from higher education, we disinvest from our cities, we disinvest from our society, right? We need to address what's actually happening. These economic anxieties are real, but we need to address them in terms of saying who are the real culprits, which is the 1/10 of 1% and the politicians who are now effectively bought. The other real anxiety is demographic. We need to be true. Look, think about someone like me. I'm born in 1964. 1964, this country was 88% white. Because we were segregated, most people, most whites, grew up in settings that were 90, 95% white. For these people, we are now 62% white. Right? This is a very, very different country, and it will continue to shift. It will continue to change. A lot of Democrats say, we don't need to deal with dog whistling because whites are soon going to be a minority. Oh my gosh, that is like one of the worst things you can say. Because it says to whites, hey, you're about to be on the losing end of racial hierarchy, right? And you better double down in your defense of whiteness, which is exactly what the social psychological studies show. The more whites understand their diminishing proportion of the population, the more fearful they become and the more politically conservative they become, right? So we need a rhetoric that says we are changing, but not a rhetoric that then dismisses the concerns that change brings, but instead a rhetoric that says, let us create new sense of social solidarity that refuses to be divided by race. Let us recover some of the American ideals which this country has always held up, though it's often failed to live up to. Let us recover those ideals of all people being created equal, and let us attempt anew to reinvest that with reality, to make that real, right? That we need a story that says we really are all in this together. The 99% coalition really is in this together once it recognizes that the biggest danger to us are divisions on the basis of race or gender or sexual orientation or religion, right? That we need to reinvigorate a sense of what makes us one people. And to do that, this is my last slide, requires that you mobilize. And by mobilize, I mean social movement. I mean, I'm not giving a talk. I love that the Democrats set up a table out there. Yay, Democrats. But this is not a story about electing more Democrats. This is a story, this is actually much more the Bernie Sanders story. This is a story of political change that says our current existing institutions will not do it. Our existing institutions, including both political parties, are today largely controlled by the very rich. And if we cannot, listen, what are the big counterweights to the power of concentrated wealth? Government, unions. Government has essentially been captured today by the very rich. Unions, we're at historic low levels of union density, right? And that means that there's only one other counterweight to the power of concentrated wealth, and that's mass public mobilization. Right? That's the only, we need mass social movement, right? And so, and I love ending on this, so go out and mass mobilize. Now, okay, how do you do that? How do you do that? You don't invent things anew. You don't invent things from scratch. You realize that mass mobilization is already starting. Between Black Lives Matter and the Occupy movement and the Dreamer movements, environmental movements, there's lots of different movements that are going on. The key is to develop an analysis, a meta-narrative that can bring these different groups together. So work within the existing groups, go out, work on whatever issue you care about. I don't care what it is. Gender, sexual orientation, environment, immigration, mass incarceration, whatever issue you want, go work on it. Keeping in mind that what's going to make, what's going to allow us to reclaim government and the marketplace is a sense that we have been divided against other poor working people, and that the only way forward is to recognize the power of the polity to reclaim government, to set conditions to work for everybody. It's that basic story that whatever issue you work on, you need the power of government to help everybody and to bring the marketplace back on the side of everybody. That's the basic story that allows us to create out of all of this ferment a unified, a sort of a coherent social movement that can actually get our country back. I'll stop there. Thank you.